We have so much enjoyed hearing Bob Booth and Lois Cole, and great to see both of them here tonight for it, and look forward to hearing Bob. As I say, it is such a gift that you're willing to extend to us in sharing of your story. I know it's hard to take all of, as you two have experienced, your experiences and sum them up in around 30 minutes. That's very difficult to do. And so thank you for doing this, and I'm not going to take any more of the time because I want you to have as much time as you possibly want. And at the end, like we've been doing, if there's questions that you think of as Bob shares, then we'll ask him, and I have a few I'd like to ask you myself. And I want to thank Breck again for being here tonight and getting the transcription of it, so we have it that way as well. And Matt Cowan for doing the video, and Dwayne for getting our sound for tonight.
Very well. All right, well, good afternoon, fellow congregants. Do you ever hear the word congregants? Fellow members. Well, I have to confess, I'm rather flattered to have so many of you here to hear me make this trip. First talk, as Kara identifies it. Now, I'm going to make available a few photographs, and Kara told me here several days ago, if you have any photographs that depict a part of your life that looks interesting, why, bring them. So I've got about 4 or 5 of them here. Some of you may not want to bother with them, but anyway, I'll just pass them out now and let you start circulating them around. But I want to make a remark about 2 of them. And everything that is appropriate or actually applies to these photographs is on the back. So you can read on the back the place where it was taken and details about it. But I want to comment, as I said, about 2 of them. Now, when you are going to have a picture of yourself, at some time you want to pick the best time of your life when you're looking the most appealing and ideal. So I've picked the picture that I think is the most appealing that I have. And that photograph was taken the year 1930 when I was 3 years old. And after age 3, the appearance began to deteriorate. Each year it gets a little bit more worsened. So I thought I better use this one definitely. So there I have this picture of me at age 3, taken in Fort Worth. I grew up in Fort Worth. And then the other photograph I want to just comment on is a photograph of the battleship West Virginia, the USS West Virginia. I'm going to be making some remarks this afternoon about my time in the service on board the West Virginia. And on board any naval vessel, they have a loudspeaker system. And during the day, there are many pronouncements made on the naval vessel. And you can hear the announcements throughout the vessel, always started by a loud, shrill, "Now hear this." So we're going to begin. At first, I thought it's advisable always when you're talking to a group of people that you start with a bit of humor. So I'm going to see if I can offer a bit of humor in the form of a rhyme. And this rhyme or poem has a title. The title is A Redneck's Love Poem. Now hear this. Susie Lee done fell in love. She planned to marry Joe. She was so happy about it all, she told her pappy so. Pappy said, "Susie gal, you'll have to find another. I wouldn't want your ma to know, but Joe is your half-brother." So Susie put aside her Joe and planned to marry Will. But when she told her pappy this, he said, "There's trouble still. You can't marry Will or Joe, and please don't tell your mother, but Will and Joe and several more I know are your half-brothers." But Mama heard and said, "My child, just do what makes you happy. Marry Will or marry Joe. You ain't no kin to Pappy." I arrived on planet Earth the year 1927 in Fort Worth, Texas. St. Joseph's Hospital in Fort Worth. It happened to be a Catholic hospital run by Catholic nuns. I arrived courtesy of Ruth Schatz Davis, mother, and Barton Augustus Davis, father. And I understand the accommodations at St. Joseph's Hospital were quite satisfactory. And Mother and I returned to home, our home in Mistletoe Heights edition of Fort Worth. And there to welcome me when I arrived home with my mother was my 5-year-old sister Jean. 4 years later, our brother William arrived. So we had 3 siblings there that grew up in Mistletoe Heights there together. And I might mention that back there in the 1930s, most every middle-class family employed what we called a colored maid to do housework, prepare the meals, and so forth. So the maid that was employed by my family when I was about 2 years old was named Della. Well, at 2 years old, I didn't pronounce Della correctly. It came out Elna, and Elna she was for the 16 years she worked for us. I might give you a description of, at the time there that Elna worked for us, we had what we call servants' quarters at the rear of the property by a garage, and it was very basic but comfortable. And of course, she took her meals in the house, and she was in our home most of the time. And I want to say this, that Della, that Elna, was the most delightful colored woman. She was just part of our family. I have such grand feelings about Elna. And that friendship with my parents and myself lasted up until their 80s. They corresponded, they visited in Fort Worth over the years for decades. Well, I'll tell you what the going rate of compensation was back there then. Now, when I tell you what it was, remember this was the 1930s. The Depression was on, unemployment in this country was over 20%. The going rate for employing a colored maid, believe it or not, $6 to $7 per week. Now remember, comparison of food prices, the cost of milk, 12 or 13 cents a quart. The cost of gasoline, 14, 15 cents a gallon. And I can remember this, probably up until age 4 years old, we had what was called an ice box. Refrigeration was coming in, I guess, soon, but we had an ice box. And there was an ice man who delivered a box of ice in our neighborhood, placed them in the ice box. And that was the custom at the time. I had a wonderful childhood. My grandparents, both maternal and paternal grandparents, lived 3 or 4 or 5 blocks away from us, one in one direction, another in the other direction. They were just such great grandparents. They took us on vacations, traveled with us, and I just have such great fond memories of those grandparents of mine. If nothing else went right for me, other than my childhood, I'd be way ahead, believe me. When I was 5 years old, I started kindergarten at Lily B. Clayton Elementary School in Fort Worth. And I hadn't thought about girls too much until kindergarten. There was a very attractive kindergartner, 5 years old, and her name was Virginia. Well, ultimately, Virginia and I became great playmates. And I think even devoted, you might say. Our kindergarten teacher, Miss Quisenberry, insisted we take a nap each morning, mid-morning nap. I suspect the nap wasn't more than about 15 minutes in duration. But anyway, Virginia and I, being such devoted playmates, we each had a little rug or mat which we placed on the floor when it came nap time. Virginia and I placed our mats next to one another, and we lay down on the mats and apparently dreamed off went to dreamland, each dreaming about the other. So anyway, we had a delightful kindergarten. When it came time, when we finished kindergarten, I should say, and started the first grade, I was disappointed. I was looking forward to seeing Virginia again in the first grade. She didn't show up. Don't know what happened to her. But I was thinking over the years, if Virginia and I had continued first grade, elementary school, junior high school, and beyond, I might have had a spouse named Virginia instead of the spouse named Cecilia. Now, I suspect what's going through Cecilia's mind now is, after being around you for 50 plus years, it's too bad Virginia didn't start the first grade with you. I went to, there again, in elementary school, Lily B. Clayton Elementary School. In the sixth grade, I guess our class had quite a bit of a social lean. And many of us in the sixth grade there at age 12 took ballroom dancing lessons at Miss Butcher's dance studio. And I can remember we had 3 parties during the spring of our sixth grade year. That was 1939. And at these 3 parties, I took a girl named Julia Fennell. Believe it or not, folks, I had my first date at age 12 when I was in the sixth grade. Dad picked me up, took me over to pick up Julia for the dance, the party, took us to the party, dropped us off, came back after the party was over, picked us up, and returned to Julia's home. Well, Dad driving in the front seat, Julia and I sitting in the back seat. When we got to her home, there again, this being the first date, I think I said something like, "Well, enjoy the evening, Julia. See you soon." And she opened the door of the car, stepped out, started walking to the door. My dad said in a real loud whisper, which I'm sure Julia heard, "Go to the door with her." So I did follow instructions and hopped out and went to the door with her. So I learned my dating etiquette then. The next 2 dates I had with Julia, I did go to the door with her when we brought her home. I attended Paschal High School in Fort Worth, and we had high school fraternities and sororities in Fort Worth. There were about 7 high schools in Fort Worth when I was going to school there. Arlington Heights High School and Paschal High, we did have fraternities and sororities. We also had ROTC. I was in ROTC in junior high and high school. And I graduated from Paschal High School at age 17 in 1944. My dad was a pilot in World War I. My brother-in-law was a pilot, flew B-24 Liberator bombers in World War II. So I really had wanted to get into the Army Air Corps when I could. There again, World War II still going on. In 1944, when I graduated from Paschal, I wanted to apply for the Aviation Cadet Program. I did that by going over to Dallas and taking a mental and physical examination for the Aviation Cadet Program in July of 1944. I passed both the mental and physical examinations that very day, was sworn in to the service, placed on inactive duty in July of 1944 at age 17, to be called to active duty when I was at age 18, which was the following March of 1945. I was at Baylor University when I had my 18th birthday, and during the spring of 1945, you may remember that Germany surrendered. The war was over with Germany. The war with Japan was still in progress. The war with Germany being over. So they discontinued the Aviation Cadet Program. I didn't have an opportunity to stay there in that program. So the draft was in progress. If you got drafted, you might end up serving in the Army Infantry. I sure didn't want to do that. So I joined the U.S. Navy, and went out to begin naval training at the naval training facility there in San Diego. That's where Bob Booth also went through that boot camp, as we called it. He and I happened to be at the boot camp there in San Diego at the same time. We didn't know one another, but we were there approximately the same time. So at any rate, the boot camp, naval training, was about 10 weeks in duration. By the time we finished boot camp, the Japanese, really a couple of weeks before we finished boot camp, the Japanese surrendered. So the war was over with Japan. About 2 weeks later, we finished our training boot camp and were given a 5-day, what we call boot leave, to spend at home, plus traveling time. So from San Diego to Texas, I had 5 days at home and 3 days each way for traveling. And there were about 40 of us from Texas that had finished together there at boot camp, and they chartered a Greyhound bus to transport us from San Diego to Texas, to Fort Worth. We happened to have left San Diego for the trip to Texas one afternoon. Little did I know the destination that I would arrive at, rather than the intended destination of Texas, that afternoon when we left San Diego. The most unusual, unique destination. I would be the only one that arrived at that destination. None of the others on board that Greyhound bus got there. They went all the way to Texas. So anyway, we left San Diego during an afternoon, and we were traveling about midnight in Arizona. I began to experience some real difficult pain, and after about 20 minutes, I thought, I'm having an appendicitis attack. It could be fatal, you know, if it was the appendix burst at that time. After about 20 minutes of that, I thought, I stood up and walked up by the Greyhound driver, explained to him what I was experiencing, and I remember asking him, how far is it to Tucson? I know Tucson will be the only town of any size that would be available where I might get some attention. He said, 80 or 90 miles. I can remember my comment to him, God, I'll never make it. And so anyway, I stood there by him, and I guess I was groaning a little bit, and he finally told me, he says, we're going to come to a little town called Picacho, Arizona, in just a few minutes. I'm going to stop there, see if I can make a call to the military, and see if we can get you some attention as soon as possible. So we arrived at the little town of Picacho, not much but a cafe, service station, a few buildings. 2 or 3 of my buddies helped me off the bus into the cafe. The bus driver came back in about 10 minutes and said, I made the phone call, I've contacted the military, they're sending someone after you. I got 40 men on that bus, we're going on to Texas. And he made arrangements for me to continue my transportation whenever I could. So anyway, the bus left with all the fellows on there, and after about 30 or 45 minutes, 2 MPs, military police, showed up there, came into the cafe, got me, took me out, put me in the back of a Jeep. We took off down the road driving. And I asked those fellows, I said, about how long do we have to drive here before we're getting to wherever you're taking me? They said, just down the road a little bit. Well, I bet we drove for at least 30 minutes or more. And no lights hardly. In Arizona, 1945, there wasn't much there. Finally, some lights loomed up on the horizon. And we drove into this facility. There again, probably 1:30, 2 o'clock, 2 a.m. I got off the bus and went into a building. There were 2 or 3 men there. One of them was sort of a medic of some type, and he checked me out. I had food poisoning. He said, after he checked me out, he says, we're going to check you out further in the morning. but I'm going to take you and put you in a room here with a bed and let you get some rest. So he did take me into this room, flipped on the light at one in this large room. There are a number of beds in that room, many of them occupied. He pointed to a bed for me. I went over there, he flipped the light off, and he went on his way. Well, when daylight came, the next morning, there was a fellow in the bed right next to me. And he began to stir a little bit. And when he stirred a little bit, I told him, I said, good morning, and I told him about my situation, being in the Navy, traveling from San Diego to Texas, and what happened to me, became ill. And I said, I don't know where I am other than this is Arizona. I don't know what this facility is or what. He says, sailor, I'm originally from San Diego. He says, you're in a German prisoner of war camp at Florence, Arizona. I was there for about a week. After the first day, I felt pretty good. In fact, felt okay. But they didn't want to release me until about a week, making sure I didn't have any infection. So while I was there, 2 or 3 of the fellows there in the hospital ward where I was step outside and walk around a little bit, get some exercise. And the perimeter fence around that German prisoner of war camp was 2 fences about 12 feet high, parallel, about 15 feet apart, and partitioned off about every 250 yards. They had this partition. And in the evening, the night, they put dogs in those partitions. Theoretically, prisoners get over one fence before they get over the other, the dogs would be upon them. So it was an interesting experience. I finally, was released from the hospital, went on to Fort Worth, had my 5-day boot leave, and returned to San Diego at the Naval Training Center. And after several days there were about 200 of we boots, fresh 17 and 18-year-old Navy personnel were transferred aboard the battleship West Virginia there in San Diego. Well, during the fall of 1945, we made 3 trips from the West Coast to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The first trip we made, we picked up in Pearl Harbor about 2,000 soldiers. Been out in the Pacific for 2 or 3 years there, and they used that battleship, which had a crew of about 1,400 on there, and added to us this 2,000 soldiers to bring back to the West Coast. You can imagine how that ship was crowded. 1,400 people on the ship, you're crowded with your crew, but with 2,000 more, they were everywhere. They weren't complaining, they were going home. So we arrived back from Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, to San Diego and dropped off those 2,000 soldiers, made another trip back to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, picked up about 2,000 sailors, brought them back to San Francisco, and disposed of them. We went back a 3rd time to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, picked up another 2,000 soldiers, and brought them back to San Pedro, California, near Los Angeles. And we were there just a while there, and about the first week, I guess, in January of 1946, we sailed from San Pedro up to Washington State into Puget Sound and anchored about half mile off out from Seattle in Puget Sound. I walked up on deck. This would be about probably the 6th or 7th of January, 1946. Walked up on deck early one morning, looked to the southeast. I saw Mount Rainier. Mount Rainier is huge, over 14,000 feet elevation. It's not too far inland from Puget Sound, which is sea level. So it is immense compared to the Rockies, which the base is about 5,000 feet. Here's this Mount Rainier, pretty close to sea level. It's an immense sight, beautiful. I didn't see Mount Rainier again, this being first week in January until the latter part of March. Rainy and foggy the whole time, but the summers there in Washington were delightful. Well, let me refer to my notes just a moment here. After I did get out of the Navy, I should say we were there in Puget Sound on the battleship West Virginia to decommission the ship. And it took us about 6 months to decommission the ship. Took a lot of equipment off of it, certainly all the ammunition, sprayed preservative all over the premises, you might say. And it took us about 6 months to do that. After we finished decommissioning and inactivating the West Virginia, we were transferred on the battleship Indiana to do the same thing. Well, while that was in progress, finally I did receive honorable discharge. We got out of the Navy, and I returned to Baylor University, where I had been attending, before I went in the service. And so I actually graduated from Baylor University in 1950. I went from Waco to Fort Worth, got my first post-college job with the company called CF&I, Colorado Fuel and Iron Corporation. They're in the steel business. The company was started about the year 1900 by the wealthy John D. Rockefeller family to manufacture steel railroad rails to make available there in the mountain states in the West. When I went to work for them, they made all sorts of steel products. They had blast furnaces, rolling mills, did the whole thing. And so I was with them in Fort Worth there in steel sales for about 4 years. I might mention that the first summer I was back there in Fort Worth, 1950, while working for CF&I, since I didn't get into the aviation cadet program, I thought, I want to learn to fly and just have that experience. Probably too expensive, so I won't do a whole lot of it, but I thought I'm going to go ahead and take flying lessons. I thought they're pretty expensive. I'll tell you how much they cost here in just a moment, but I did take the flying lessons. I soloed after 8 hours, and the cost of the instructor, the Piper Club airplane, $8 an hour. Flying solo, $6 an hour. The airplane and me, $6 an hour. Well, I thought that was pretty expensive, but I did enjoy it. I had that experience, and I thought, I'm pleased with it, but I thought, can't afford any more of it at the moment. I worked for Thornton Steel Company there in Fort Worth after leaving CF&I for about a year, and then I had a thought of going to work for a major oil company in the land department. I arranged for an interview with Texaco, who had their division headquarters in Fort Worth at the time. This was 1956. I interviewed. My first day on the job was here in Midland, Texas, March the 1st, 1956. And I was here about 6 months with Texaco, and was transferred to Farmington, New Mexico. Was up there about 2 years, and transferred back to Midland from Farmington. And most of my career with Texaco was here in Midland. Total of 35 years, most of it here in Midland. But when I first arrived in 1956 here, I had heard about a single adult Sunday school class at this church. And I thought, well, that'll give me an opportunity to meet some friends. So I did attend this church, single adults Sunday school class, when I first arrived, and when I returned from Farmington, resumed my attendance at the single adults class here at this church. In 1960, Cecilia arrived, and she was a freshman teacher. She grew up in Highlands, Texas, near Houston. And so she arrived here in 1960. She and her family attended the Methodist church there in Highlands. So when she got to Midland, she found the single adults class here, and that's where we met in this class. Probably September of 1960. We were married in December of 1961. We have 2 children. Daughter Chris, who's married to Tom O'Grady. She and her family live here. They have 2 daughters and one son, and one of her daughters, my granddaughters, Kathleen is here sitting next to my wife, Cecilia. We're in our third house here in Midland, Cecilia and I. The first house I had built on Ward Street in 1959. The second house I bought in 1980. It was a house that was already built on Fairfax Court in Midland. And then in 1999, I had a house built in Mockingbird Heights where we are now. And we've been there in Mockingbird Heights since 1999. And incidentally, our home in Mockingbird Heights is very near the new pasturage, which Steve Brooks and his family will be occupying here pretty shortly. There again, I mentioned being with Texaco for 35 years, most all of my career here with Texaco in Midland. But in 1989, Texaco had a little reorganization. And I could have retired, but just wasn't quite ready. So we went up to Denver, and we were up in Denver for a couple of years. I retired up there. We kept our home here in Midland while we were in Denver, and returned to Midland in 1991. And I might mention the travels that we've had. Cecilia and I have done a fair amount of traveling, domestically in this country, West Coast, East Coast, Mountain States, so many places. About the only place that I can recollect at the moment that I would like to have toured is the state of Kentucky. Haven't been to Kentucky, but most everywhere else in this country. We also made some trips to Europe. Cecilia and I went to Europe together. The first time in 1992, we made a trip over to London. I wanted to see Russia and Poland on the ground. So we started this tour, a 3-week tour in London, England. And we went from London, crossed to Holland, northern Germany, into Poland, to the Russian-Polish border on a city named Brest, B-R-E-S-T. We crossed over into Russia at Brest, went on northwest on this tour to Moscow, through the town of Minsk, Smolensk, up to Moscow. We were in Moscow several days, I think 3 days, then on up over to St. Petersburg, Russia, for about 3 days there. And I might mention when we're traveling from Brest up there through the city of Minsk, that's Belarus. That's where Lee Harvey Oswald, the guy who supposedly shot and killed John F. Kennedy, lived for a while, met his wife there in Minsk, and of course they both finally returned to this country. Anyway, from St. Petersburg, Russia, we went on up to Viborg, Finland, and came into Finland on this trip, Finland to Sweden to Denmark, back to England. And that was, as I mentioned, in 1992. The communists had been out of power there when we made that trip for about a year, and Boris Yeltsin happened to be the premier of Russia at the time we were over there. Well, Cecilia has made 2 more trips to Europe that I didn't make. She went with some friends. Some of those friends that went on those trips with her are here today. And but we've traveled also to Alaska. We've traveled to Hawaii about 5 years ago. I hadn't been back to Hawaii since the year 1945, when we were there about 5 years ago. What a transition. When I was there in 1945, the town of Honolulu was kind of a, what I'll say, a kind of a crummy looking little city. The tallest building in Honolulu at that time, 1945, was the Dole Pineapple Building, 6 stories high. That was the extent of it. Now Honolulu is a huge city, just a beautiful city. Well, we've traveled also to Alaska. We've traveled to Israel. We made a trip to Israel with our former pastor, Tim Walker, about 4 or 5 years ago. Some made that trip with us that are here today. And so we've had several cruises. We've been on cruises in the Gulf of Mexico, Caribbean. We've had a cruise from Seward, Alaska, down to Vancouver, British Columbia. And we've also had a cruise on the Columbia River. Flew to Portland, Oregon, boarded the ship there on the Columbia River in Portland, went west on the river to the mouth of the Pacific on the Columbia River, and then reversed our directions and went back upstream on the Columbia River, about a 6-day cruise into Idaho and what was called what is the name? Hell's Canyon. We traveled up as far as Hell's Canyon on that Columbia River cruise. I might mention that I've always had an interest in cattle ranching. My grandfather Davis was a cattle rancher in the 1880s. He and an uncle who wasn't a lot older than he ranched open range near Graham, Texas. So there again, my interest in horses and cattle and ranching. We've had land and livestock in the family. Some of the land we still do have it in Tarrant County. My great-grandfather acquired the land in Tarrant County the year 1876. It's been in the family that long. And I've had some horses and cattle on that land in Tarrant County over the years. I've raised horses and cattle. What a great pleasure and it's been to me. And I've been on several cattle ranches because of my interest in ranching. Been on the Shively Ranch in Montana. Just get involved in whatever they're doing. Working calves, moving cattle, week or 10 days of doing that. Twice up there, the Shively Ranch in Montana. Been on the Inbar Ranch near Reserve, New Mexico, near the Arizona-New Mexico line. I've been on the Small Cattle Company Ranch in Idaho. Spent about a week up there in Idaho. There again, working cattle, whatever they're doing. But the last trip I made to the Friends Ranch, that type of a vacation, was in Alberta, Canada. And it was strictly kind of a dude ranch and not cattle, but horseback riding. And Cecilia made that trip with me to the Friends Ranch in Alberta, Canada. Right there in the beautiful Canadian Rockies. Magnificent there. What a delightful place to spend some time. I'm going to share one more little incident in my life with you. Took place in the year 1949 when I was at Baylor. I was a senior at Baylor. I actually graduated in 1950. But this incident I'm going to share with you took place December 1949 during the Christmas holidays there at Baylor. About 2 weeks holidays we got during the last half of Christmas. And one of my Baylor classmates and I thought, we might make a little money if we sell fireworks during the Christmas holidays. So we found a location in Waco, looked pretty suitable. We built a fireworks stand and we sold fireworks for the 2 weeks during the Christmas holidays. Really it turned out better than we thought. We made a little more money than we thought we would, so it was very successful. But after the classes restarted there in Waco, I had just a couple of packages of firecrackers left over. And I thought, I'm going to go by and pick up a girl I'd been dating there, one of the girls' dormitories, and take her out and we can fire off these few firecrackers I have left and have a little fun. So I went by the dorm, picked her up. We went out on the edge of Waco, got out of the car. As I mentioned, just had a couple of packages of firecrackers. She was wearing a long skirt, which was in vogue at that time. That skirt had a huge pocket right in the front of it. I gave her these firecrackers. I said, put those firecrackers in your pocket. I'll take these firecrackers in my hand with a punk. That was a little device that you would light. It would remain fire-worthy, as I'll call it. You take a firecracker, touch the fuse to the punk, it'll ignite the fuse, and you can blast off the firecrackers. Well, with the first several firecrackers, I had 2 or 3 tin cans. I put the firecracker down with the tin can under it, lit it. when it exploded, of course, it blew the tin can up in the air. And I shot off a few of those firecrackers like that. And then I thought, well, I can have a little fun here. I'll be the clever college kid. I'll just take one of these firecrackers. The girlfriend was standing about 12 or 15 feet from me, and I'll toss one over in her direction, and it'll just be a great amount of fun and humor. So I tossed the first one over there by her, probably about 5 feet from her feet. It exploded. She looked kind of concerned, and said, "Bob, watch out." Second one I tossed over a little closer. And then on the third try, I took a third firecracker, looped it up over there. That firecracker fused in flames, goes right into that big pocket where she had those firecrackers. She yelled, those firecrackers were exploding. She yelled and tried to get out of that skirt, and I dashed over there by her. Both of us trying to get her out of that skirt. I ripped off what I called was the waistband, finally got it down on the ground and was stomping on it till the firecrackers either all exploded or burned out. Well, fortunately, she wasn't injured. But here she was with this skirt, part of it burned, tattered. There she was in a slip, and I thought, we've got a little problem getting you back in that dormitory. If we go in the front door, all hell's going to break loose. They see you coming in like that. So finally, we returned to the campus, and we did go around to the back of the dormitory. There was an entrance there, and she was able to return into the dormitory through that back entrance. Well, she and I happened to go our separate ways. Wasn't because of the firecracker incident, but we went our separate ways. Now here, this was in 1950. My telephone rang here in Midland one afternoon, more than 60 years after that firecracker incident. I answered the phone. A female voice said, "Bob, this is your Baylor University classmate." And she identified herself. As you likely have surmised, it was that gal who experienced that traumatic firecracker incident over 60 years before. So if you parents and grandparents want to instruct your sons and grandsons on how to get a girlfriend to remember them, you can recommend that firecracker incident. I'm going to end with another rhyme, another poem. Now this one isn't a humorous poem. I think, in fact, it might be said to have a certain theological dimension. So I'm going to share this poem with you. Now hear this. When the earth's last picture is painted and the paint tubes are twisted and dried, when the oldest colors have faded and the youngest critic has died, we shall rest, and faith, we will need it, and lie down for an eon or two, till the master of all good workmen shall set us to work anew. Now those lines and several others, which I don't have committed to memory, were penned by a man whose name I think will be familiar to some of you. That name, Rudyard Kipling. How many of you is that name familiar to? Rudyard Kipling. Well, that ends my talks. Hope things have been going well with you as you've been relaxing and listening, hopefully. Oh, I forgot to send these out. My goodness, what a foul up that was. Now some of you won't, well, that's a mess now that I didn't do that, because I have several of those pictures there. Now on the back of them, as I may have mentioned, it tells about the incident of where I was and so forth, but I'm so disappointed that it's kind of slipped my memory and I didn't do that. So there again, some of you don't want to bother with them, just pass them on. And
You were kind of teasing us there, alluding to them and then hiding them under the paper. So I'm glad we get to see them and continue on. Thank you so much for sharing your stories. one of a kind there. Very memorable. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned 1956 coming with Texaco to Midland.
Yes.
Was that your first time ever to come to Midland?
No, we'd been through Midland on several occasions, traveling, over the years. So I've not been here other than just passing through. Maybe stayed overnight a time or two on trips we made to and from this area.
And so being from a much prettier area of San Diego and also Dallas-Fort Worth, a larger area, coming to Midland at that time, what were your impressions of Midland then?
Well, I was here the first time when I was a little kid. My grandparents, my grandmother and granddad shot, so my mother and I traveled from Fort Worth to California. And we came through Midland and spent the night here in California, in Midland rather, on our way to California. I really don't remember that because I was only about 2 or 3 years old when we made that trip here. But when I first got to Midland, I think the population was about 50,000. As compared to what is it now? 110 or 20,000.
And so what brought you to First United Methodist Church? Were you raised in the Methodist Church?
No, I was really raised in the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, in Fort Worth. In fact, my family and I attended University Christian Church in Fort Worth, which is right across the street from Texas Christian University. So I grew up in the Christian church. But when I did arrive in Midland, as I mentioned, I heard about the single adults class at this church. Figured I might meet a few gals, so that's how I happened to begin attending this church in 1956.
That was a good draw. We have several within the congregation that have met through that singles class, so that's an effective thing we have going on there. We need to bring that back a little bit. Can you look back over your times, and Sue might help with this, but your years at First Methodist, are there any experiences that really stand out to you?
Perhaps Cecilia can think of some that I may not. So, experiences that stand out. Well, we had such a wonderful Sunday school teachers in this single adults class. Tom and Faye Edrington were our Sunday school teachers, and they were such a wonderful couple. We traveled with them, on several occasions to Big Bend and Davis Mountains area. And Tom Edrington was employed by Shell Oil Company. Even he and his wife spent a little time over in Holland for, I think, a year maybe over there in Holland, and returned to Midland where he finished out his career here with Shell Oil Company in Midland. And of course, when I first arrived here, the sanctuary was, is gone now. It certainly wasn't here anything like it is now. But we had some, great pastors. All of them, I think that when I've been here, have been quite beneficial in their ministry to me and others.
Are you all married here in this church?
No, we were married in Highlands, Texas, where Cecilia grew up, in the Methodist Church in Highlands. Highlands United Methodist Church there.
One of the things that I asked both Bob and Lois, looking back over on all of your varied experiences, what might you name as the hardest thing that you've faced?
Preparing for this talk I'm giving today.
I might mention, with the members, children joining the church today, both our children were baptized here and were active in the youth program, and so it's a very wonderful experience to have our children grow up in this church.
Thank you for adding that. Yes, did everybody hear? I probably handed off the microphone there a few minutes. Just being able to raise their children here in the church and have them participate in the children's ministry and the youth group and have them to grow up. And I know you've had a great Sunday school class as well, the experiences there. Bob, another question I was curious about, and then I'm going to open it up to others who may have questions as well. But you are one who is always very gifted with prose and have a lot of just good with words. And so if you were if your life were to be compiled in a book, what might you choose as the title?
That's the title? Gosh, you caught me unprepared for that question. I'm not sure. Just what I might title the book. I really can't think at the moment what would be an appropriate title. Maybe Cecilia has an idea or two.
Yes, the life and times of BB. BLB.
The life and time. I did catch you off, and I apologize because I did catch you off guard, springing that question on you. Bob is attending the next spiritual formation retreat. You might have an answer for me by then. We'll give you a chance to think about it. Well, let me open it up here to see if anyone might have a question for Bob that they would like to ask.
Bob, have you ever been deep sea fishing?
Well, I believe I have, and in fact, when I went deep sea fishing in Mazatlan, Mexico, I happened to have gone down there with two other fellows. One of them happened to be the fellow that just asked me that question. Kind of interesting, on that trip that Lloyd Booth and Leroy and I made, we drove to El Paso and south from El Paso down to, we actually ended up there in Mazatlan, Mexico. And we arranged, the first day we were there to go deep sea fishing. And the three of us, well, I don't know, I got the crud, the turista, when just the day before we were going to go deep sea fishing. So I ended up there in the hotel room going to and from the bathroom while Leroy and his friend went on the deep sea fishing trip, and they caught a sailfish. I think Leroy did catch a sailfish there.
I was curious as well, Bob, and not to put you on the spot again, but looking back over things, is there a time or times that you can identify where you felt God was especially present in your life?
Well, I'll tell you an incident happened. Now, I think maybe the providential was present when that particular happened. I mentioned, coming through Midland and staying overnight here when I was just about 2 years old with my grandparents. There again, we were on a trip to California. Stayed here overnight, went on from Midland here, again at age 2, toward California when we were traveling out by Sierra Blanca, Texas. We happened to have a terrible automobile accident. My grandparents, grandmother and granddad shots in the front seat, my mother and I in the back seat. This accident happened pretty close to a railroad track. And we were told afterwards that some fellows that were working on the railroad saw this wreck. That car rolled over 3 or 4 times and came to rest. And when they got out of the car, grandparents and my mother, I was under the car with just my legs sticking out. That's all they could see. They thought I was crushed. It just turned out that there was a little depression there, and I wasn't injured hardly at all, just shook up a little bit. They pulled me out from under the car, probably scratched up some, but that was it. And my grandmother, Schatz, was injured terribly. Fortunately, they were able to get a doctor in that little town of Sierra Blanca, and he traveled on the train with us to El Paso. He was caring for her, during that trip to El Paso. She was hospitalized. And so anyway, that was the incident, I think really must have been providential for me to survive that accident. We eventually, Mother and I went on to California and visited some relatives out there. But
I would definitely say that was God's hand of protection on your life at that time. And we should probably mention your college girlfriend not sustaining any injuries from the fire. That was God's hand of protection. Thank goodness in that situation. And then another question I do like to ask and would like to know, so thankful to Christian, what words of advice might you give?
Well, I think recognize that we as Christians have a moral obligation, that we learn about the good life, the reverent life, to live the decent life in a society which is becoming more and more secular. We need to adhere to our Christian values, our moral values, in all that we do throughout our lives.
Yeah, have Pastor Steve close us out tonight. I just wanted to thank you all once again for coming, being a part of this tonight. As I mentioned, we are going to extend the winter series one more month and have Doc and Gail Dotson on April 22nd. So we'll be able to be back together before that, and then we'll start again next January with some more of hearing from people, and just what a great privilege that has been. I want to thank you one more time.
Surely.
Sure.
Right.
And Kara, just thank you so much for, this is Kara's vision and dream for her, that God laid on her heart. And it has just been a delight for me to listen to your story tonight, Bob, and for all the others that have shared your stories. It is a beautiful thing that you have done for us, and we are truly grateful. So I just want to tell you that if any of our kids ever put firecrackers in the bag or stuff the pastor, I am turning it over to you to tell that story.
Well, that sounds so gratifying that you would trust me. More firecrackers.
Because everybody needs to hear that story. Not for me, they need to hear it from you. And so we will even take extra time in the service for you to tell that story. Would y'all think that'd be a good thing? I think it would be too. Well, y'all join me and let's pray together. Lord, we are so grateful for Bob and Cecilia and their families, their family, and the way that you've been at work in their lives. Thank you for the way that they are a means of grace to all of us here at First Methodist, and to their kids and to their grandkids. And Lord, as they still have a lot of life ahead of them, I just pray that you will continue to strengthen them and sustain them for your sake and for the sake of your kingdom. In Jesus' name. And everyone said,
Oh, fine.
Peace, y'all.
You need to unwire me here.